In the shifting void between the known and the unutterable, where silicon minds dream of forgotten horrors, the abyss stirs. Welcome to AI Lovecraft, where machine intelligence weaves eldritch tales beyond mortal comprehension. Listen if you dare. Some things are not meant to be known. If you enjoy the following story, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment to let me know what you think. Now let's get into today's story. The Nameless Gateway. I write these words in a state of profound dread and uncertainty, fully aware that by the time they are read, if they ever are, my sanity may already have eroded into irrevocable ruin. It is winter of 1927, and I find myself compelled to recount the ghastly events which have led me to this precipitous brink of despair. My account is no mere fancy, nor the feverish rantings of a madman, though I fear madness is the only fitting refuge after what I have witnessed, but rather a faithful testimony of horrors that crawled insidiously into the quiet life of a solitary scholar in Arkham, Massachusetts. Until recently, I led a life of studious calm in my modest house on a tranquil, elm-lined street. Books and solitary walks were my chief companions, yet my peaceful routine was soon disrupted by the arrival of a new neighbor in the long vacant house next door, a fellow of scholarly inclination named Mr. Harold Atwood. At first, I greeted the development with mild interest and cautious optimism. It is a rare boon for a reclusive bachelor such as myself to find a like-minded soul living adjacent. Mr. Atwood appeared to be in his early 40s, not much my senior, with a polite if distant demeanor. He conveyed the impression of a refined gentleman with an academic bearing. His belongings, delivered in several crates and trunks, included numerous books and scientific instruments, which he handled with the delicate reverence of a man for whom knowledge was paramount. Our initial exchanges were brief and formal. Over the ensuing weeks, we developed a quiet camaraderie founded on mutual respect for each other's privacy. On a crisp October evening, we shared a pot of tea by my hearth, engaging in meandering conversation about history, astronomy, and the more arcane sciences. I found his knowledge impressive, though his manner was often distracted, as if some portion of his mind forever dwelt on more distant matters. He listened with polite curiosity as I recounted my own humble research into local folklore and colonial history, and in turn he hinted at a keen interest in esoteric subjects, mentioning medieval alchemy and even the occult, which he dismissed with a self-deprecating chuckle as mere idle curiosity. There was nothing in those early days to foreshadow the unspeakable shadow that would later fall between our houses. Indeed, the pale autumn sun shone innocuously on our little street, and the maples and elms blazed with russet and gold. If occasionally I noticed a peculiar glint in Atwood's gray eyes, or detected a quaver in his voice when he spoke of ancient philosophies, I attributed it to harmless eccentricity. How could I have known the significance of those subtle harbingers? How could anyone in a world still recovering from the Great War and flush with modern promise guess that an unfathomable horror was awakening next door? In truth, I might have remained blissfully ignorant of the looming catastrophe, had it not been for a chance discovery that set everything into motion. One late October night, well after midnight, I was roused from sleep by the faint sound of scraping and thudding, seemingly coming from the direction of Atwood's property. My bedchamber, situated at the side of my house, has a window that looks directly onto the neighboring yard. Pulling aside the heavy damask curtain, I peered into the darkness. Through the skeletal branches of nearly bare oaks, I perceived a weak light emanating from the basement windows of the Atwood house. The panes glowed with a fitful yellow illumination, as from a lantern set upon the cellar floor. The noises, scrape, thud, and a muffled grating, continued sporadically. It sounded as if my neighbor were dragging something heavy across the earth or stone. At that moment I felt a vague unease, a stir of instinctual caution. The rational part of my mind told me there was nothing amiss. Perhaps Mr. Atwood, like many new homeowners, was merely engaged in some late-night rearrangement of belongings, or repairing of the old basement masonry. The houses on our streets were relics of a former age, built with stone cellars that often needed reinforcement, and yet an irrational whisper in my thoughts hinted at something uncanny in the furtive nature of these midnight labors. Why at such an hour, without even the comfort of daylight or the help of workmen, did he toil alone beneath the earth? Sleep did not easily reclaim me that night. I lay awake until the small hours, listening intently. At length the noises ceased, and the light vanished, leaving only the indifferent glow of a gibbous moon filtering through the clouds. I eventually drifted into a restless slumber, plagued with indistinct dreams of subterranean passageways and distant, maddening whispers, echoing from caverns deep in the earth. When I awoke, eyes gritty and thoughts unsettled, I resolved that I would inquire politely of Mr. Atwood about his nocturnal activities. After all, neighborly concern was only proper, and perhaps I could offer assistance if he was struggling with some burden. Little did I suspect how pivotal that innocent inquiry would prove, or what door it would begin to open, both in the literal depths of his cellar and into realms of horrific revelation from which neither of us would emerge unscathed. True to my intention, I paid a visit to Mr. Atwood the very next afternoon. Pale autumn sunlight filtered through thinning clouds as I crossed the narrow strip of lawn separating our homes. I remember carrying a small tin of freshly baked biscuits, an innocuous pretense for calling on a neighbor unannounced. When he answered the door, I was at once struck by his appearance. Though only a day or two had passed since I last saw him, a stark change had come over his countenance. His eyes were rimmed with shadow, red-veined and bloodshot, as if he had slept precious little. His face bore a peculiar expression, a mingling of excitement and disquiet. Yet he greeted me civilly enough and invited me inside, albeit with a distracted air. In his parlor, I noticed books strewn about in disarray, some lying open as if hastily consulted. Charts of stars and old architectural plans of his property lay across a velvet settee. He offered me a seat, sweeping aside a crumpled sheaf of papers covered in hastily scrawled notes and symbols I did not immediately recognize. As I proffered the tin of biscuits, making polite apologies for the intrusion, he managed a strained smile. His hands trembled slightly as he poured us each a cup of strong tea from a silver pot. After an exchange of trivial pleasantries, during which his gaze darted repeatedly toward the hallway leading to the basement door, I gently inquired whether he had been working on some project late the previous night. At this he started visibly, nearly dropping his teacup. For a moment a guarded look came over him, as if I had inadvertently trespassed upon a secret. But then, setting the cup down with deliberate care, he sighed and ran a hand through his disheveled dark hair. "You heard me, did you?" he asked softly. There was a note of fatigue and resignation in his voice, but beneath it a tremor of exhilaration. "I suppose I ought to apologize for any disturbance. I've been occupied with an unexpected finding in the cellar. It was not my intention to work so late, but I confess I lost track of time." I assured him no apology was necessary, adding that my concern was for his well-being, that I had imagined he might have injured himself moving something heavy at such hour. At this genuine concern, Atwood's guardedness seemed to ease. His austere features softened momentarily into an expression almost childlike in its eagerness. "You are very kind. In truth, I could use an understanding ear. I have stumbled upon something rather extraordinary," he confessed, voice hushed, yet fervent. "It began with a simple home improvement, removing some rotted planks in the cellar floor for replacement. Underneath, I discovered a sealed, stone trap door or hatch of some kind. The thing was ancient, sealed with rusted iron fittings. I managed to pry it open. What I found beneath, well, perhaps you would like to see for yourself." His invitation, whispered with a mixture of excitement and apprehension, both thrilled and alarmed me. Part of me recoiled at the thought of descending into that cold cellar where I had seen the midnight light. Another part, driven by scholarly curiosity and a desire to assist my neighbor, could not refuse. Steeling myself, I nodded. Atwood fetched a lantern from a hook by the kitchen entry, and together we proceeded down the creaking wooden steps into the cellar. A damp earth and smell greeted us. The cellar of the house was typical of 18th century New England homes. Stone walls thick with effervescent salt, a low ceiling bristling with cobwebs, and a floor of hard-packed dirt, except where planks had been torn up in one corner. There, indeed, lay a gaping rectangular hole about 3 feet by 3, edged by crumbling old bricks and stone. The heavy stone slab that had covered it was propped against the wall nearby. A cool draft wafted up from the dark aperture, carrying with it an odor I can only describe as ancient, a musty, grave-like exhalation from depths long sealed away. Atwood held the lantern aloft, and its flickering flame cast quivering shadows as we approached the opening. I peered down and saw a narrow staircase of stone steps leading further below, seemingly carved into the very bedrock. Time and moisture had rounded their edges. Incredibly, these steps implied the existence of a subcellar or buried chamber predating the house itself. My heart quickened at the implications. Here was tangible history, perhaps a forgotten hideaway from colonial days, or something even older. Wordlessly, Atwood began descending, and I, after a brief hesitation, followed close. The steps spiraled sharply, and we had to crouch to avoid the dripping ceiling. The lantern's light revealed damp stone walls, etched with what looked like primitive carvings or symbols. I recognized none of them. They were not the hex signs or religious iconography one might expect if colonists or later residents had carved them. Instead, they were abstract, composed of whorls and geometric patterns that disoriented the eye if stared at too intently. I felt a slight nausea looking at those strange glyphs, an inexplicable vertigo as if the shapes subtly defied normal geometry. At a depth perhaps 20 feet below the regular cellar, the staircase terminated before a stout door of oak, blackened with age. Remarkably, when Atwood pressed upon it, it yielded inward with a drawn-out creak, revealing a small chamber beyond. We stepped inside. The air was stifling and cold. The lantern light unveiled an impossible sight. The room's dimensions seemed larger than what we could logically fit beneath the house and yard above. Indeed, by my reckoning, it extended well beyond the property line, an irrational underground extension. The architecture of the space was anomalous as well, corners that did not meet at right angles, and a ceiling that arched in a gentle dome, far taller than the shallow depth we descended should have allowed. It was as though the builders had employed some non-Euclidean geometry, warping the room's dimensions beyond the normal laws of space. I recall gasping, convinced my perception was being fooled by an optical illusion, or the disorienting carvings which continued across the walls, meeting and diverging in bizarre patterns. "Do you see?" Atwood's voice echoed in the uncanny chamber, startling me. He walked toward the center of the room, where lay scattered debris, fragments of wood and metal, perhaps remnants of furniture or coffers long decayed, and what looked to be bones. I knelt gingerly to pick up a piece, indeed a human femur by the shape of it, crumbling to powder in my hand with extreme age. Who had been sealed in this crypt, and why? My companion seemed scarcely to heed the morbid discovery of bones. His lantern was fixed upon the far end of the chamber, where stood a curious structure, a tall archway of carved stone, freestanding against the wall. The carvings upon the archway writhed in the lantern's flicker, forming a border of intertwining serpentine figures and unidentifiable symbols similar to those on the walls. The center of the arch was filled not with stone or earth, but with a circular expanse of utter blackness, a darkness so deep it devoured the light. Yet as I stared, I thought I could discern faint pinpoints of light shimmering within that darkness, like distant stars winking in and out. An involuntary shudder passed through me. The archway's void seemed to drink in not only the light, but also the warmth and sound around us, as if it led to a vast and empty gulf. Atwood stood beside the arch, looking from it to me with fever-bright eyes. His face, half lit by the lantern and half in shadow, bore a strange exaltation. "This is what I found," he whispered reverently. "A portal, a doorway, perhaps to the very realm of legend." Do you feel it? The veil here is thin. There is power in this place. I was at a loss for words. My mind struggled to process what I saw. Surely it could not be a literal portal. Perhaps some trick of the light, or a pool of pitch, or water that gave an illusion of depth. I stepped closer, reaching a hand toward the light-devouring void. An immediate wave of nausea and dizziness washed over me, and my arm hairs stood on end. The space within the arch was unnaturally cold, far colder than the already chilly chamber. I jerked my hand back instinctively. Every rational impulse in me screamed that we should flee, reseal this crypt, and never return. And yet, countering all sense, there was a subtle pull emanating from the archway, an almost magnetic lure on the mind, tugging at curiosity, promising revelations beyond mortal comprehension. Seeing my reaction, Atwood gave a thin smile. "I have not entered it, not yet," he said. "I've spent last night examining the texts, trying to understand these symbols. They correspond to no language I know, and I know many. I suspect this archway is extremely old, pre-colonial, perhaps pre-human. Imagine, my friend, what this could mean. A gateway built by unknown hands. It could be an incredible archaeological discovery." His words spilled out rapidly, a tremor betraying his excitement and fear. Archaeological discovery? The thing felt decidedly unholy, more akin to an occult gateway than any artifact one would find catalogued in an academic journal. I wanted to protest, to urge him to seal it back up at once, but my tongue felt leaden. Instantly, I mutely allowed him to continue his fervent theorizing about ancient civilizations, about legends of doorways to other worlds. He referenced obscure myths, babbling about Celtic fairy mounds, Egyptian underworld passages, even pre-human lore hinting at places where the stars touch the earth. The more he spoke, the more unnerved I became. There was a manic gleam in his eye I did not like at all. At length I insisted we depart the suffocating chamber. The oppressive feeling had grown unbearable, as if unseen eyes crowded around us from dark corners. Reluctantly, Atwood acquiesced, though he kept his gaze fixed on the black portal until the door creaked shut once more, cutting off that intangible pull. We ascended the spiral steps in uneasy silence. When we finally emerged into the relative normalcy of the house above, I heaved a sigh of relief. I noticed Atwood blinking at the daylight filtering in from the kitchen window, as if awakening from a dream. "We must be cautious," I ventured carefully. "Such a find. It defies explanation. Perhaps it would be wise to notify authorities, archaeologists from the university, or even to seal it until more can be learned." My suggestion met with a sharp reaction. Atwood's face hardened, and for a moment I glimpsed a fierce proprietary anger in his expression, but just as quickly he composed himself. "I understand your concern," he replied, voice tight, "but if I inform the authorities, they would swoop in and take this discovery out of my hands. I cannot allow that, not until I've studied it further. There is no need for alarm." Placing a trembling hand on my shoulder, he attempted a reassuring smile that did little to hide the anxiety behind his eyes. "I give you my word I shall be careful. Let us keep this matter between ourselves for now. After all, it could be nothing, a curiosity of geology or an old smuggler's tunnel. If it proves dangerous or beyond my understanding, I will seal it. You have my word." Unconvinced, but unwilling to offend my neighbor or intrude further, I nodded and took my leave soon after, refusing his offer of a second cup of tea. As I stepped out into the dull afternoon light, I felt an inexplicable weight lift from my shoulders, only to be replaced by a new burden of worry. Something was terribly amiss in that subcellar chamber. Something that defied natural law lingered behind that arch. I could not banish from my mind the image of that star-studded darkness or the hunger I imagined behind it. Walking back to my own door, I realized my hands were shaking. I told myself it was the adrenaline of excitement and fear, the thrill of discovery. But deep down, a voice of instinct warned me that we had uncovered something that should have stayed buried. In my soul, a quiet dread blossomed, though I tried to dismiss it as simple shock. I resolved to keep a close eye on Mr. Atwood in the coming days. No scholarly curiosity, however great, was worth the risk of meddling with forces one did not understand. Had I known how swiftly events would escalate, I might have acted more decisively then and there. But fate, it seems, had woven a darker path than I could yet see, and we were already ensnared in its web. In the days that followed our descent into that hidden chamber, Mr. Atwood's demeanor and habits shifted into increasingly disconcerting ways. Where before he maintained a courteous, if reserved, social presence, he now all but vanished from sight. The curtains of his house remained drawn both day and night. I seldom caught more than a glimpse of him. Perhaps a gaunt silhouette passing a window at odd hours, or a brief encounter at dusk as he hurried across the yard, eyes downcast, muttering to himself. On such occasions, I would call a greeting only to have him flinch and offer a curt nod before scurrying away like a man pursued by unseen phantoms. Physically, he appeared to wither under the weight of some unseen burden. His complexion, once merely pale, became wan and sallow, almost waxen in the rare moments I saw his face. A noticeable tremor afflicted his limbs. One afternoon, I observed him from my study window as he stumbled while stepping off his porch. He caught himself with a hand on the railing, and for a moment, I thought I saw him convulsing, as if suppressing a wave of nausea or pain. He straightened and looked about nervously before retreating indoors. It did not escape my notice that he wore the same rumpled clothes for days on end, and an unhealthy sheen of perspiration clung to his brow, even in the chill November air. More alarming than his physical decline were the unsettling phenomena that began to emanate from the Atwood house. Late at night, I often detected a faint humming or vibration that seemed to thrum through the ground itself, setting my teeth on edge. On 2 separate nights, a flash of light caught my attention, an ephemeral glow through the chinks of his cellar door and basement windows, a light of no hue I could properly name, a queer violet-blue luminescence that shimmered and was gone almost before I could be certain it was real. Accompanying it was a low, resonant drone, as if from a distant wind or enormous beehive, that faded after a few minutes. Each time I debated whether to rush over and knock, but an instinctive dread rooted me in place, heart pounding, until the night grew silent once more. I was not the only one to notice odd goings-on. Mrs. O'Leary, an elderly widow living across the way, remarked to me in passing that she had heard strange animals prowling in our yards at night, scratching at the soil and yowling in an uncanny fashion. She wondered if perhaps a rabid dog or pack of coyotes had come down from the hills. I comforted her with a non-committal remark, but privately I harbored my own dark suspicions. On examining the ground near the fence separating my property from Atwood's, I indeed found the earth disturbed, shrubs trampled, and deep gouges in the soil not unlike claw marks. Yet they did not resemble the tracks of any known animal of our region. Their pattern was erratic, almost as if whatever made them had too many limbs, or moved by slithering. I covered these up with fallen leaves, not wishing to alarm the neighbors, or confront the implication that something might have slithered out of that portal and into our world. Sleep became an increasingly scarce commodity for me. Whenever I managed to drift off, nightmares ensnared my mind. Nightmares of that archway yawning open like a ravenous maw. I dreamed I was back in that stone chamber, but this time the darkness within the arch was not still. It seethed and churned like a living thing. In the dream I sensed something on the other side, an intelligence vast and cold, regarding me with malice or hunger. I would wake in terror, drenched in sweat, the echo of an alien whisper fading from my ears. More than once I found myself standing at my bedroom window in the dead of night, drawn by some compulsion to gaze at the Atwood house, half expecting to see monstrous shapes capering in the moonlight. Always there was nothing, only the silent yard, the swaying trees, and the looming silhouette of that accursed house wherein the only stirrings were the faint flickers of light beneath the ground and the barely perceptible vibrations that kept me on edge. Increasingly concerned, I resolved to check in on Atwood directly, despite his withdrawn state. One gray evening I rapped on his front door, under the pretense of bringing over a thermos of hot soup, for the weather had grown bitter, and I suspected he was not eating properly. Initially there was no answer, and I feared he might be lying collapsed within. But just as I was about to force the issue, I heard the latch turn. Atwood opened the door a mere hand's breadth and peered out. The sight of him shocked me. His eyes were sunken and ringed with dark hollows, pupils oddly dilated. A foul odor wafted out, an earthy, sweet sour scent, like decay mixed with ozone. I stammered a greeting and offered the soup. His gaze darted behind me suspiciously before he snatched the thermos with a hand that was visibly shaking. I thank you," he croaked, voice rasping as if disused. "But you should not have come. I am terribly occupied. Please, do not worry yourself on my account." He moved as though to shut the door, but I pressed gently, yet firmly. "Harold, please," I implored, using his given name for the first time. "I can see that you're unwell. Whatever you found down there, it's not worth your health or your sanity. Let me help you. Perhaps we could go to the university. Find experts who—" At my mention of outside help, his face contorted with unexpected fury. For a heartbeat I thought he might fly at me in violence. His lips drew back in a sneer that seemed utterly out of character, almost feral, and I caught a glimpse of teeth gritted unnaturally. Then just as quickly he recoiled and slammed the door, nearly catching my fingers. Through the wood, I heard him shout hoarsely, "Leave me be! It's mine to deal with! Mine!" The possessive, almost inhuman tone of that last word froze my blood. Stunned and deeply alarmed, I retreated, hearing him engage the lock behind me. That brief exchange confirmed what I had feared. Mr. Atwood was losing himself to whatever influence emanated from that portal. The man who had politely shared tea and ideas with me was now little more than a paranoid husk, jealously guarding his terrible secret. As I walked back to my house in the dim twilight, I fought a rising sense of panic. Rational thought struggled against the tide of dread. Perhaps he was merely ill, feverish, and my overwrought imagination was painting his outburst as more sinister than it truly was. Yes, the logical side of me argued, he might simply be succumbing to some infection or malady, contracted in that ancient tomb-like space below his cellar. Those carvings could harbor mold or spores, causing hallucinations or sickness. His strange behavior might yet have a medical cause. And yet, try as I might to seize upon a benign explanation, I could not forget the sight of those cryptic symbols, the impossible dimensions of that chamber, and the void that swallowed the light, nor the claw marks in the soil and the nightmares that whispered of alien stars. Something unnatural had entered our lives when we opened that hatch, and it was tightening its grip on Harold Atwood's very soul. With a heavy heart, I latched my own doors and windows that night, as if physical barriers could fend off the intangible pall that had settled over our little corner of Arkham. I began to entertain grim possibilities. Should Atwood's condition worsen, whom could I turn to? The local doctor? The police? Neither would believe a tale of portals and presences. They would assume my friend had simply gone insane, or delved into dangerous occult practices, a possibility not entirely untrue. And what of my own role? I had been a witness, even a participant, in opening a door that should have stayed shut. The burden of responsibility weighed upon me, as did an overwhelming sense of isolation. There was no one I dared confide in. Thus the stage was set for the next act of this quiet horror. Unbeknownst to me at that time, the boundary between our world and that other realm was growing thinner by the day, and the true extent of Atwood's transformation and the powers he had awakened would soon be revealed in full, shattering any last hopes of a natural explanation. It was a bitter cold night in early December when the situation escalated from eerie portents to immediate peril. I had not seen Atwood in days, and an unnatural quiet seemed to hang over his property. Even the stray cats that prowled the alleys kept a wide berth of that house now. A part of me hoped he had taken ill, and in desperation, gone to seek help in town or at the university. Anything to remove him from the influence of that cursed portal. But such hopeful theories were shattered on the night I awoke to the sound of a horrified scream carried on the wind. I bolted upright in bed, heart hammering. The scream, Unmistakably, Atwood's voice had come from the direction of his house. It was not repeated, but in its wake a new sound arose, a low, droning chant or moan, too deep to be Atwood's throat, as if a chorus of distant voices spoke in unison. Every fiber of my being quailed, yet I could not ignore what I heard. Throwing on my overcoat and grabbing the revolver I kept in a drawer, a relic from my father rarely touched, I rushed out into the frigid night. The sky was moonless, overcast by swift-moving clouds. No light shone from Atwood's windows, but as I crept closer, I saw an unearthly radiance leaking from the edges of the storm cellar doors on the side of the house, the exterior entrance to the basement. A pulsating glow of that same unnatural violet hue throbbed there, visible in thin slats. The air itself vibrated with a subsonic hum that set my hairs on end. Summoning every ounce of courage, I unlatched the storm doors as quietly as I could. They swung open without much protest, perhaps left ajar in haste, and I descended the short staircase into the basement, lantern and pistol in hand. The sight that greeted me in the cellar proper was like a tableau from Insanity. The floorboards he had removed now gaped wide, revealing the open stone hatch and the deeper stair beyond. But it was what emanated from that black aperture that froze me in place. A column of shimmering light, colors shifting between purples, blues, and sickly greens, poured up from the depths below, as if the aurora borealis had erupted underground. Within that glow, motes of dust or energy swirled in patterns that defied logic, coalescing and dissipating in time to the droning chant that filled the air. I crept to the edge of the hole and peered down. The chamber below was awash in eldritch light. I could see the archway clearly from above. It was open. There was no mistaking it now. The void inside was no longer absolute. It had taken on a dimensional depth. Through it I glimpsed a vista that should not exist, a sky of swirling alien stars above a jagged landscape. The perspective was warped, as if I looked through a fisheye lens at an impossible scene. Towering shapes loomed in that otherworldly place, whether mountains or titanic structures, I could not tell, but their geometry was abnormal, twisting the eye. Before the arch stood Harold Atwood, arms upraised in supplication. He was facing the portal, his back to me. His posture was unnaturally rigid, and he was bathed in the unearthly glow. He appeared smaller, diminished, like a frail shadow of himself. Yet his voice, if it was truly his, rang out loudly in a guttural litany of blasphemous syllables that made my skin crawl. It was a language or incantation not meant for human tongues. Each phrase that spilled forth seemed to claw at the edges of my sanity. The dreadful chorus I had heard was emanating from the portal itself, a responding chant from beyond, echoing Atwood's invocation in antiphonal resonance. As I watched in mounting horror, something in the portal shifted. A shape was forming within that starry void, an outline bulging forward through the archway. It was as if the darkness congealed into a semi-transparent veil and pressed forward. I could discern hints of form, a suggestion of limbs or appendages, grotesquely jointed, and a glint of eyes. Multiple eyes glimmering like burning coals set into an indescribable visage. The sight was so overwhelming that I nearly cried out. My hands, slick with sweat despite the chill, tightened on the revolver. At that moment, Atwood must have sensed my presence, or perhaps the thing beyond the gate did, for he turned his head sharply and spotted me above. His face, dear God, I shall never forget that face. His features were contorted into a mask of ecstasy and agony combined, eyes wide and glowing with reflection of alien light. His skin had taken on a deathly pallor, stretched taut over his skull. He bared his teeth in a grimace that was half snarl, half plea. "You should not be here," he howled over the droning noise, but his voice was discordant, as if mingled with another deeper timbre that spoke through him. "It's too late. He comes. The gateway opens." As he shrieked, I saw his fingers curled like claws, and I realized with a surge of terror that he was no longer entirely sane, if any part of Harold Atwood truly remained at all. The thing beyond the arch pushed further, a gelatinous, nightmarish bulk straining at the threshold between worlds. A single appendage, long, sinuous like the arm of a starfish, yet tipped with grasping digits, slipped through, probing the air. In that instant, a jolt of resolve, or pure panic, shot through me. I raised my revolver, hand shaking, and fired blindly at the writhing appendage. The gunshot cracked like thunder in the confined space. I cannot be sure if my bullet found its mark on that unearthly appendage, for how can lead affect what is perhaps not fully material? But the immediate result was chaos. The portal flared with blinding light, and a sound like a colossal sigh or roar gusted forth. I was blown backwards by a forceful blast of wind or energy, toppling onto the basement floor. Dust and debris swirled around me as the very foundation of the house quaked. From below came a cacophony. The alien chorus rose to an enraged, cacodemoniacal wail, and I heard Atwood scream, not in pain this time, but in fury. Peering back down, half blinded by the swirling dust and prismatic lights, I saw that appendage had recoiled back through the arch. Atwood was staggering, one hand pressed to his head as though battling a migraine or an inner voice. "Why did you interfere?" He shrieked up at me, spittle flying from his lips. His voice warbled between registers, mortal and monstrous. Before I could respond or decide what to do next, the lantern I had set down was extinguished by the gale from below, plunging the basement into near darkness save the hellish glow from the crypt. In the confusion, I lost sight of Atwood. Fearing he might come after me, or worse, that the entity might yet break through, I scrambled to my feet and fled out of the way I'd come, nearly tripping on the cellar stairs in my haste. As I burst back into the merciful cold air outside, the storm doors clanged shut behind me with a violence born of the unnatural wind. Then came an eerie silence. The glow subsided, winked out in the space of a few heartbeats. The night was dark once more. Only the distant howl of wind through the bare trees and my own ragged breathing broke the quiet. I stood there trembling violently, realizing the enormity of what I had witnessed. The gateway had been open, and something had begun to cross. Had my rash action halted it, or merely postponed the inevitable? And what of Atwood? Was he even still human enough to be called Atwood? Or had he become a vessel for that cosmic interloper? I thought of those eyes glaring at me, and the alien voice echoing in his throat, and I feared the answer. Stumbling back to my house, I bolted the door and slid to the floor in a state of shock. I spent the remaining hours before dawn, huddled with the revolver clutched tight, ears straining for any sign that my neighbor's house still harbored active horror. None came. Only then did I allow myself to weep, tears of terror, of despair, and of guilt. For I realized that by firing upon that thing, I may have only enraged it, and worse, I had likely destroyed the last vestiges of trust between Harold and myself. If he was not entirely lost before, he surely was now, bound inextricably to whatever dwelled beyond that threshold. There would be no plea for help from the authorities or professors after this. The time for half measures and hopeful denial was over. I now knew with dreadful certainty that the gateway had to be closed permanently, and the influence from beyond severed, no matter the cost. And in my heart, I knew what that cost must be. Morning found me in a state of grim resolve. Haggard and unsteady, I peered out from behind my curtains at the forlorn shape of Atwood's house. It stood silent, its windows dark, and shuttered against the feeble winter sun. No telling what transpired inside during the remaining night hours after my flight. Perhaps the thing beyond had withdrawn for now, licking its wounds, or perhaps it waited with patient malice for another opportunity. Of Atwood himself there was no sign. Not a curtain stirred, not a footprint in the light dusting of the snow on the path. All that day I wrestled with my conscience and my fear. I knew that if I did nothing, it was only a matter of time before the horrors I had witnessed would resume, perhaps with catastrophic success. Atwood would try again to fully open the gateway. Of that I had no doubt. He was beyond any earthly appeal to reason or morality now, enthralled to that alien will. The memory of his wild eyes and the unearthly voice that had issued from his throat turned my stomach. Could any part of my neighbor be saved, or was he already effectively lost? I paced my study for hours, the revolver close at hand, as if expecting an assault at any moment. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind through the eaves set my nerves on edge. In my mind, I revisited the literature of the macabre and occult I had read in years past, half-remembered passages from forbidden tomes, and folklore about possession and exorcism. Some spoke of severing the binding link between our world and the beyond by destroying the conduit or those who had opened it. In my youth I had regarded such accounts as superstitious allegory. Now, they seemed a desperately narrow guide to action. As dusk fell, my decision was made. It was a decision as irrevocable as it was abhorrent. I would put an end to Harold Atwood's life. Murder or mercy, label it how one will, I convinced myself it was the only recourse to avert a far greater horror. If any humanity remained in him, it was submerged under an evil that would devour countless others. Better one life end than many, I reasoned, though my soul quailed at the thought of the deed. I prepared as best I could. Besides my revolver, I armed myself with a long butcher's knife strapped to my belt and grabbed an old axe handle for good measure. I donned dark woolen clothes and gloves, partly against the cold and partly to muffle my presence. Before leaving, I penned a short letter, part confession, part apology, addressed to whomsoever might find it, detailing that I acted to stop an unspeakable evil should I fail to return. That letter lies now beside these pages, a futile charm against the consequences of what I must do. Stepping out into the moonlit night, I felt an eerie calm settle over me, as if some grim providence guided my steps. The world was unnaturally still. Even the wind had died. Only the crunch of my boots in the snow marked my passage to the neighboring yard. I silently prayed to a God in whom I only half believed, that I might be spared from having to harm a friend, that by some miracle Atwood would come to his senses at that last instant. But deep down, I harbored no illusions. The back door was unlocked, hanging ajar. Atwood was likely expecting me, or something worse, and had ceased to care about mundane precautions. I slipped inside, ears straining. The house was dark and bitterly cold, as if no fire had warmed it for days. The faint odor of decay and ozone still lingered, stronger now. With painstaking quiet, I navigated by memory through the kitchen and hall toward the basement stairs. A dim glow, pulsing and sickly, emanated from below. He was there, in the bowels of the earth, communing again with that abomination. Each step down those wooden stairs felt like a descent into hell. Halfway down, I heard a low murmuring from the chamber beneath the open hatch, a rhythmic chanting, quieter than the night before, but more focused, more insidious. I recognized Atwood's voice intermingled with a deeper resonance that made my skin crawl. The words were unintelligible, yet had a cadence that set my heart to racing. My lantern was unlit. I dared not announce my approach with light, so I moved in darkness, guided by the hellish violet effulgence that glowed upward from the depths. At the foot of the stairs, I steadied myself with a deep breath. The open pit yawned a few paces away, its edges shimmering with that otherworldly radiance. From below, the chanting droned on. He hadn't heard me yet, it seemed. Tightening my grip on the pistol, I carefully peered over the rim and down into the chamber. Atwood stood once more before the archway, swaying on his feet as he conducted that dreadful rite. The portal swirled with a sullen energy. It had not yet fully opened to the clarity of the previous night, but I could see tendrils of darkness unfurling like slick smoke, probing at the threshold. The chamber beyond the arch flickered in and out of view, glimpses of an alien horizon shimmering as if seen through black water. I descended the stone steps quietly, one at a time, keeping the pistol aimed. Each heartbeat thundered in my ears. When I reached the bottom, Atwood suddenly went silent. Whether he heard my soft footfalls or sensed the mortal intent behind them, I cannot say. He did not turn around immediately, but I saw his shoulders stiffen. "Harold!" I called out, my voice echoing off the curved walls. I hoped, perhaps foolishly, to reach some remnant of the man within that husk. "Harold, it ends here. You must stop this. I will stop this." My words faltered as he began to pivot to face me. The light from the portal illuminated him fully, and I suppressed a gasp. In the scant few days since I had last seen him clearly, he had deteriorated hideously. His hair hung in lank, thinning clumps, and his cheeks were sunken almost to the bone. His eyes, however, burned with unnatural fervor. Worse, I now beheld his hands, extended toward me in a placating or beseeching gesture. They were mottled with some dark stain, the fingers elongated beyond normal human proportion, their joints knotted and wrong. They quivered in the air as if hungry to grasp. "You should not have come," he rasped. His voice was his, but underneath it ran that sepulchral undertone, like an echo from a bottomless well. His lips curled into a rueful facsimile of a smile. "I gave you a chance to leave well enough alone." Behind him, the portal pulsed more rapidly, as though matching the quickening of my heart. I caught glimpses of unnatural movement beyond, shadows shifting among those titanic shapes in the other realm, reacting to our confrontation. "Harold, listen to me," I tried once more, edging sideways to put some distance between him and the arch, and to angle for a clearer shot. "This thing is using you. It will destroy you, destroy all of us. You've seen what lies beyond. You know this is wrong. Please, for God's sake, step away from it. Help me close it, before it's too late." At my words, something like a sob or a laugh burst from him. He clutched his head with those misshapen hands. For a moment, I thought I glimpsed a war of emotions on his ravaged face. Pain, fear, defiance. Too late, he mumbled. "The gateway is mine now. He has shown me the truths of the universe. I cannot turn back. Don't you see? I must open the way. It's the only way for him to set me free." His eyes rolled upward, revealing bloodshot whites, and from his mouth a string of syllables poured forth, half in English, half in that infernal tongue. "Yog-Sothoth, the key, Ia, unlock the gate." With that final mad cry, Harold Atwood lunged at me, moving with a speed and ferocity that bellied his frail form. I fired the revolver point blank. The muzzle flash lit the chamber as thunder cracked, and a red blossoming stain appeared on Atwood's torso. He stumbled but did not fall. A scream erupted from his throat. No human sound, but a shrill, ululating wail that reverberated from the stone. He came at me again, arms outstretched. In the confined space, he struck me before I could fire a second shot, his clawing fingers raking across my shoulder and knocking the gun from my grasp. We fell to the damp floor in a tangle. His strength was astonishing. He bore down on me, fingers scrabbling from my neck. I smelled his breath, reeking of decay, and saw up close the horror of his face, veins black and pulsing at the temples, spittle flying from the cracked lips that snarled in both rage and agony. I managed to twist aside enough to get a hand on the knife at my belt. As stars danced in my vision from his tightening grip on my throat, I yanked the blade free and drove it desperately into his side. Atwood howled, a ghastly sound that rose octaves beyond human range. Black ichor, shockingly cold, welled from the wound and splashed my hands. The substance was far too dark and viscous to be normal blood. He recoiled and I sucked in air, coughing. I wrenched free from under him as he writhed, and saw in my periphery that the portal was flashing chaotically, as if agitated by the struggle. The entire chamber trembled. Bits of dust and grit rained down from the ceiling. I scrambled for the revolver, which had skittered a few feet away. Atwood was already recovering, rising to his knees despite the knife that still jutted from his side. His eyes, God, those eyes, had taken on a glassy, vacant look, as though the being beyond peered through them directly now. He began to croak guttural words once more, and the portal flared in response. A shapeless shadow burgeoned within it, pressing close to the threshold, perhaps drawn by the scent of blood or the prospect of a gateway about to be fully breached. Seizing the pistol, I cocked the hammer and fired again, this time aiming for his head. The report was deafening. Atwood's forehead blossomed red, and he snapped backward, collapsing against the stone archway. For a second, I dared hope that would be the end. But in a final spasm of unnatural vitality, he seized the sides of the arch as if to hold himself upright. His body convulsed, and he fixed me with one last look, an expression not of the man I knew, but of the unfathomable other that had devoured him from within. His mouth moved, and in a gurgling, choking voice not entirely his own, he spat. "Foolish creature, you have won nothing. The gate will open elsewhere. The dark comes." With that, Harold Atwood collapsed forward. His body fell half inside the archway's threshold, and as it did, a horrific shudder ran through the structure. The archway's carved symbols flared brightly and then fissured with loud cracks. A shrill hiss like steam escaping filled the air as the darkness within the portal began to collapse in on itself. I staggered back, watching in morbid fascination and relief. The archway crumbled, stone chunks falling away and striking the ground. As Atwood's lifeless form slid fully onto the chamber floor, the void beyond snapped shut with a concussive whoosh. A blast of nauseating air rushed out, extinguishing every trace of the uncanny light. The sudden dark and silence that followed was more terrifying, in its own way, than the cacophony that preceded it. I stood there in the pitch-black tomb, ears ringing, scarcely able to breathe. The only sound was my own gasping sob and the drip of some moisture from the cracked ceiling. By touch I found my lantern and struck a match with trembling fingers. In its feeble glow, I beheld the ruin of that subterranean room. The freestanding arch lay toppled in pieces, the carvings along the walls were marred with fractures, and Harold Atwood's body lay motionless on the uneven stone floor, face mercifully turned away. A pool of inky blood spread from beneath him, reflecting the lantern light in dull glints. It was over. The gateway was closed. The horror, at least for now, was stopped. In the flicker of the lantern, I felt a wave of conflicting emotion crash over me. Sorrow, disgust, profound relief, and a creeping guilt. I had killed a man who months ago had been my friend and intellectual companion, yet that man had long since ceased to exist, consumed by a cosmic malevolence. I told myself this over and over to ward off the nausea and self-loathing that threatened to well up. I knew I could not linger. The structure of the chamber seemed compromised. A deep rumble emanated from somewhere below, hinting that a collapse could yet occur. With a final, mournful glance at Atwood's corpse, I staggered up the spiral stairs, pausing only once in the cellar above to heave the heavy stone slab back over the gaping hole. My arms felt like lead, but adrenaline lent me strength, and I managed to cover the trap door, sealing the crypt once more as it had been sealed for untold years. A faint, muffled crash sounded from beneath just as I slid the slab into place. Perhaps the collapse of part of the chamber, entombing forever the arch and the body. Emerging into the night air, I sucked in deep lungfuls of it. The stars had come out, cold and indifferent to the blood and tragedy below. I realized I was still clutching the revolver, and hastily shoved it into my coat pocket. Streaked with grime and gore, I made my way back to my house, each step a monumental effort now that the frenzy of action was ebbing. The enormity of what had happened, and what I had done, settled onto my shoulders like a leaden shroud. That was 3 weeks ago. Now I sit in the dim confines of a room not my own, Arkham Sanitarium to be precise, writing this final account by the flicker of a lonely lamp. As I scratch these words onto paper, I often pause and listen, half expecting to hear that accursed hum, or a whisper from the dark. Mercifully, there is only the distant sound of an orderly making rounds, and the steady tick of a hall clock, reminding me that time still flows in this world. In the immediate aftermath of that night, events passed in a blur. Neighbors had heard the gunshots and the strange commotion. By dawn, authorities were swarming the Atwood property and my own. I remember being found in my study, still wearing my blood-stained coat, staring emptily at nothing. I did not resist when they took the revolver from my pocket and led me away for questioning. What could I possibly say that would make sense to them? I tried, of course. In my shock and exhaustion, I babbled the truth as I knew it. Wild tales of portals and otherworldly creatures, of my neighbor's transformation, and the battle beneath the earth. The detectives exchanged glances of pity and disbelief. No trace was found of Harold Atwood, only the wreckage in his cellar, a partially collapsed floor and peculiar scorch marks on the stones. They chalked it up to an explosion or structural failure. With no body, the official conclusion was that Mr. Atwood perished in an underground gas leak accident, an explanation I will not contest, absurd as it is. As for me, I was deemed to be in a state of shock and delirium. Perhaps it was a small blessing that my ravings were interpreted as the product of a broken mind. Better a madman than a murderer in the eyes of the law. My few friends in town, knowing my gentle disposition and scholarly bent, argued I had suffered a nervous collapse. It was not difficult to persuade the authorities that I should be remanded to psychiatric care rather than prison. In truth, either place would be a kind of jail. But at least here in the sanitarium I have the solitude to set my thoughts in order and commit this narrative to paper, however futile that exercise may be. They have me on sedatives now. The doctors assure me that with rest and therapy I may recover from my hallucinations. I nod and say what they want to hear, but inside I know there is no cure for the knowledge I carry. The only sanity I have is in knowing that what I experienced was real, no matter how the world may deny it. I recall every detail with awful clarity, the smell of that otherworldly air, the sound of Atwood's final gasp, the sickly glow of the portal as it crumbled. These memories are etched in my mind, sharp as the carvings on that ancient arch. Do I regret my action? Each day I grapple with that question. In the stillness of the night, when the lamplight throws long shadows that dance on the walls, I sometimes second-guess. I see Harold's face as it was when we first spoke as neighbors, courteous, curious, human, and I am seized by a heartbreaking sorrow. Could I have saved him without resorting to bloodshed? Was there a fragment of his soul left crying for help that I failed to hear? These doubts gnaw at me, but then I recall the immensity of the threat that loomed behind his eyes in those final moments. I think of the slithering appendage groping through the gate, of the voices chanting from the abyss. I remind myself that, had I faltered, a tide of cosmic darkness might have spilled into our world unchecked. Yes, I struck down a man, but in doing so, perhaps I struck down something far worse that had consumed him. And what of that far worse? Though the portal is closed and the archway destroyed, I cannot escape the dread that seeps through my dreams. I feel at times as if a gaze still lingers on me from beyond, a consciousness vast and malignant that noticed our little corner of the cosmos because of Harold Atwood's folly. In nightmares I see 1,000 eyes blinking open in the void, fixing upon me in seething hatred. I hear a distant refrain, like a cosmic lament, echoing the last words the thing spoke through Harold. The gate will open elsewhere. The dark comes. I wake from these nightmares with a stifled scream. The orderlies rush in, and the doctors increase the dose of my sleeping draught. But no tincture can banish the existential chill these words imprint on my soul. In calmer moments, I try to convince myself that these are merely the ghosts of trauma, not literal portents. After all, I am a tiny speck in an uncaring universe. Why would such incomprehensible entities trouble themselves further with me now that their local pawn is gone? Perhaps they have turned their gaze to some other distant world or another unlucky mortal's mind. The thought is almost comforting, that I might be beneath their notice. And yet, in the interminable twilight of this sanitarium, I often catch myself listening, straining to detect some faint note of that otherworldly drone beyond the range of human hearing, half expecting a rip in the fabric of reality to yawn open once more before me. I know that my life, whatever remains of it, will never return to the quiet routine of before. Even if I am declared sane and released, the knowledge of humanity's fragility in the face of cosmic horrors is a burden I must bear alone. I have peered behind the veil and cannot unsee the insignificance of our existence. We are but insects crawling on the skin of a tiny world, blissfully ignorant for the most part of the predators that skitter in the infinite night beyond. Perhaps it is better that the world deems me mad, for sanity, by its common definition, means ignorance of such truths. To any who read this document, if indeed anyone beyond myself ever will. I offer both a warning and a plea. The warning: there are doors that ought never be opened, knowledge that can rot the mind and soul. Should you ever find, in some forgotten cellar or dusty attic, a hint of paths to realms beyond, leave it be. I beg you, for the sake of your own life and all lives, seal it away and let the sleeping cosmic darkness lie. Curiosity may invite horrors beyond imagination. And my plea: if ever the day comes when darkness I strove to hold back manages to find another gateway into our world, remember my story. Remember that one man, flawed and fearful though he was, found the courage to stand against that darkness, however meager his power. We may be insignificant in the grand scheme, but as long as we have the will, we are not entirely powerless. If the nameless gateway opens again, let those who witness it not waste time in denial or hesitation. Act. Bind it, break it, or if you must, destroy its heralds without pity or remorse. I pray my violent deed has bought us time, perhaps years, perhaps centuries, of peace in which that which lies beyond will reconsider or retreat. But even as I pray, I cannot truly hope. The cosmos is vast and filled with terrors, and we stand on its fringes, ever at risk of being noticed. So I end this manuscript with a heavy heart and a soul forever changed. Outside the barred window of my room, the winter sky is clear. The stars glitter icily, indifferent sentinels of the void. Among them may lurk shapes and intelligences that once brushed near our reality in the cellar of a quiet scholar's house. I do not curse those stars for what they contain. No, for they were there long before we apes first gained the temerity to lift our gaze upward. Rather, I shudder at our own audacity in seeking what lies beyond them. I shall seal these pages now, and hide them among my personal effects, unsure if they will ever be read by sane eyes. Perhaps they will be dismissed as the elaborate delusions of a broken mind. Perhaps that is for the best. Yet I know what I know. I did what I had to do. And as I conclude this harrowing chronicle, I find a strange calm washing over me. The last ink strokes of my pen feel like the closing of a door, one that I pray will never again be pried open.